Nobody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody in 149th Street at the bench.
Pieces in graffiti are known for having explosive color that pops off walls. But getting your graffiti to have that explosive effect can be really difficult for anybody who's not comfortable with color or shading. And that's what we're doing here today. I'm going to teach you guys a really easy trick in order to add that dramatic flair to your graffiti that'll really help it to pop off of walls. The effect is reflective lights, also known as bounce lights. And the more you understand value, form, and color, the better you're going to be able to utilize this technique. But to begin explaining how reflective lights work, let's just for a second put color to the side and focus only on value. So imagine for a second, in our example, the sun here is beaming down little rays of light. And as these little rays of light travel, they're going to hit a surface like the floor. And when it does, the floor is going to sap away some of that light, weakening the light as a result. Now our light beam is going to ricochet off the surface, and well, in this example, it's going to bounce into our sphere here, illuminating the underside, creating our reflected light. Now due to this weakening effect, anything our light bounces over to can't possibly be as luminous or as bright because it lost some of that brightness. Now in art, this light will help us add some contrast to our darker areas and can help us define edges as well, which is going to be really useful for a lot of artworks you're going to create in the future. But we'll show examples and explain more on how that functions later in the video. What's important to know though is this process of the light bouncing everywhere continuously happens until the light loses too much energy, and as a result, we can no longer see it with our eyes. However, there are some surfaces that are much more reflective to light and some that aren't as reflective. Take metal and cloth for instance. When you look at a piece of metal, you're going to see really strong highlights and really strong shadows with very defined edges between the two. In fact, the metal might be so reflective to where you can actually see your own reflection in the metal. As for something like cloth, isn't nearly as reflective, and as a result, the highlights and the shadows are a lot softer. And you certainly aren't going to be seeing your reflection in something like this beanie here. Now that we understand the basic gist behind how reflective light functions, let's bring color back into the fold because this is where things get more fun, a little bit more technical. A key thing to understand about light in general is lights give off color. The light bulb in your room might be a little bit more warm, giving off yellow, oranges, or something of the sort. Some lights might be a little bit cooler. They might give off more of a blue color. Regardless, most lights have a color that they give off. So let's say our light source in this example here shoots down some yellow beams of light. When that yellow beam of light first makes contact with the surface and the light are going to trade colors with one another just a little bit, and they're going to mix together as a result. And once our beam of light hits the surface and ricochets off, it'll not only get weaker, but it'll also carry away some of the color from the surface. Now remember, our beam of light not only is weaker, so it's not as luminous, it's not as strong, but it also becomes a little desaturated. The question now becomes, for artistic purposes, when we're painting our images, how do we determine the new color of the surface and the new color of the light after they've made contact with one another? If we're looking at the color wheel, it'd be easy to think you just shoot the color closer to the center where it's a lot less saturated. But remember, everything is trading colors with one another. Because of this, going straight towards the center won't account for the influence of the new color. Instead, the trajectory looks a little bit more like this, where the dominant color will get more desaturated as it arcs towards the new color. Now this only tells us the direction we're going to go in for our new color, but it doesn't tell us exactly what the color is. Now how far along this path our final color will be is determined by how reflective the surface is, how intense the light is, as well as what two colors are mixing. With all that in mind, it's possible that you could have two opposing colors, for example red and green, but yet they have very subtle changes in their transitioning color. Or they can have huge changes. Once again, it's dependent on how reflective the surface is and how intense the light is. Check out the reflective light on this apple. It doesn't look like a pure green. It's nowhere near as green as the grass surrounding the apple, but the green is still reflecting some of that color onto the apple. So if we were to color pick the reflective light, you'd end up seeing that the color we end up with is a little bit more of a brown, and the brown isn't as saturated as the initial red. Now don't get me wrong, the brown isn't completely gray, right? You don't have to take it to that extreme. In this instance, the influence from green ends up being very subtle. But due to that green influence, you'll notice that the actual hue itself starts to move towards green, even though it never actually reaches there. And along the way, it gets a little bit more desaturated and slightly darker as well. And this is the process you'd follow in order to figure out the color influence of any two things coming in contact with one another as far as reflective lights are concerned. And it's actually a fun lesson to learn here. So little fun fact, if you're standing in a nearly pitch black room, we as human beings can't really see saturation at that point. And because of that, we practically see in black and white. You can actually test this out. So like at night, or if you have a really dark room, you can just turn out the lights and you'll notice everything just seems to be black and white, or pretty close to it. And this teaches us a valuable lesson. It teaches us that that no matter what the color is or how different the colors might be, they all have gray in common. So not only does gray allow us to unify all of these different reflective lights, but it also allows us to transition from one color to another. This is how colors in the real world actually function, and it's why sceneries that you might see outside look as beautiful and harmonious as they do, despite having all of these different color variations. Colors that you wouldn't think would go together suddenly seem to go together. This is also why just blasting the saturation in your paintings is oftentimes a terrible idea, because you're getting rid of that unifying aspect between all colors. So while reflective light is bouncing around us at all times, everywhere, in all directions, especially with something like ambient light, like the blue sky for example, light that isn't directly coming from the light source, in art we only really paint reflective light in shadows. We'll call this the shadow family. And the reason for that is because this is where we're able to directly observe and see them in an isolated environment, since reflected lights are too weak to be observed in an isolated manner when looking at the light family, or anything not in shadow. Once again, I stress, reflective lights are influencing everything at all times, even in the light family in real life, but once again, for artistic purposes, we can't really isolate reflected lights in the light family. Now this is really important to understand, because reflected lights exist in the shadows, their value can't be the same or higher than anything outside of the shadow family. If your reflective lights achieve a value that is equal or greater to anything that is outside of the shadow family, then you would just end up with a secondary light source. You'd end up with a rim light or something to that effect, which is no longer a reflected light. Now for the purposes of graffiti or cartoons or any art form that pretty much isn't hyperrealism, and in all admission, even hyperrealism to some extent, you can exaggerate your reflected lights to be more saturated or lighter. You just gotta be careful with how far you take that. Alright, so that's the basic gist behind reflective lights and how they work. But how would you exactly use these in a piece of art? Well, reflective lights are great for re-establishing really dark edges. Edges that would otherwise be lost edges. Edges that you would no longer see. You could throw in a reflected light in there in order to re-establish a form and bring that back out. Make that figure, that form, pop away from the background, separating it from the background. For graffiti's purposes, this can really be useful to help you establish letter structure. Or it can be useful to help you get that pop effect off the wall. It can really help a piece explode off of a surface, like you're seeing right here. Plenty of graffiti artists use this to great effect, and in graffiti, because graffiti is so dramatic and exaggerative, you can take reflective lights and push them really far. But that's not all reflective lights can do. Reflective lights can help you add color back to an area that was previously dull. And depending on how far you want to take this technique, reflective lights can help you make an image look very realistic, even though it might not necessarily be realism. If we look at the sculpture of Abraham Lincoln as an example, we can see that there's a red piece of paper on the shadow side of Abraham Lincoln. The light is coming down, hitting that piece of paper, and reflecting off of the surface, carrying that red color over to the shadow side of Abraham Lincoln. Now, a couple key things to notice here. Because the sculpture is white and doesn't have a natural color of its own, it's acting as a clean slate as far as color is concerned. So we're able to see a nice, very saturated, very bright red reflective light. I wanted to show you guys this because it serves as an example of how reflective lights aren't necessarily just purely desaturated grays. Now this topic can get really in-depth, and in this video we've only scratched the surface, right? This is an introduction to reflective lights, if anything. So I want to encourage you guys to dig deeper on this topic. That way you can really get the most out of this technique, because it really is an amazing technique. In fact, if I could, I'd love to recommend this book right here, Vision and Art and the Biology of Seeing. It has to be one of the best books I've read about colors and light and how it functions. It's written by people who are way too overqualified to be writing art books, and I'm thankful they did. But if you're interested to learn how to shade graffiti and how to do a bunch of other really essential techniques for graffiti, check out the book we wrote. This will teach you how to shade realistically, it'll teach you how to shade in various different ways, and applies all that to graffiti. That way you can do this on your graffiti. Along with that, you'll learn perspective, drop shadow, 3D, you'll learn a bunch of other things. You can pick that up in the description, and if you want to check out the best how to do graffiti tutorials anywhere online, we got this playlist up here with more graffiti content right down here, and I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thanks for watching.